For 23 years, the wealthiest woman in Elkhorn Valley lived in a hole in the ground. Stay with me. The year was 1879 when Nora Brennan lost everything that mattered. Her husband to a mine collapse, her reputation to a town's grief-stricken need for blame, and her claim to the modest homestead they'd built together on the eastern slope of Copper Ridge. What she gained in return was 60 acres of land so worthless that the town council considered it a punishment, a rocky stretch at the valley's northern edge, where nothing grew but sage and bitterness, and where a collapsed mine entrance yawned like a black, toothless mouth in the hillside. "Let her have the cursed ground," Jonas Wheeler had said at the meeting that decided her fate. "Let her live with the ghosts of the men that Hole swallowed." They gave her until the first snow to vacate the Brennan homestead. They expected her to leave the valley entirely, to take the hint and drift east toward civilization or west toward oblivion. They certainly didn't expect her to hitch her late husband's draft horse to a wagon loaded with tools, a single trunk of belongings, and 3 months of provisions, and drive it straight toward the abandoned mine, like a woman keeping an appointment with the devil himself. She was 26 years old, with hands already calloused from 3 years of frontier work, and eyes the color of creek water after rain, gray-green and unreadable. A shaggy dog with fur the color of wood smoke trotted alongside the wagon, his amber eyes fixed on Nora's face as though she were the only fixed point in a spinning world. The dog's name was Flint, and he was the only creature in Elkhorn Valley who had never doubted her. They called it the Morrow Mine, named after the man who dug it 15 years before Nora arrived in the valley. Thomas Morrow had been convinced there was gold in Copper Ridge. Real gold, not just the copper that gave the mountain its name. He'd spent 3 years and his entire fortune carving into the hillside before a tunnel collapse killed him and 2 hired men. After that, the mine sat abandoned, its reputation as cursed as the widow they'd banished to its doorstep. Nora stood at the mine entrance on that first October afternoon, Flint pressed against her leg, and studied what the town had given her. The main tunnel extended perhaps 30 feet into the hillside before rubble blocked the passage. But Morrow had been ambitious. There were 2 smaller chambers branching off the main tunnel. Neither collapsed, both carved into solid sandstone that had been stable for millennia before men started blasting. She walked inside, one hand trailing along the stone wall. The air was cool, not cold, despite the autumn chill outside. She'd noticed the same phenomenon in her grandmother's root cellar back in Pennsylvania, the way the earth held its temperature like a secret, neither freezing in winter nor sweltering in summer. Her grandmother had grown up in the Black Forest of Germany, where people had been building into hillsides for centuries. "The earth remembers," Oma used to say, her accent thick even after 40 years in America. "The earth keeps what you give it. Warmth in, cold out, cold in, warmth out. You work with the stone, not against it." Nora had been 12 when Oma died, but some lessons carved themselves into bone. She returned to the wagon and began unloading. Thomas Brennan had been a good man and a hard worker, but he'd never understood Nora's fascination with her grandmother's stories. "That's old country thinking," he'd say with a gentle smile. "We do things different out here." He wasn't cruel about it. Thomas was never cruel about anything. He simply believed, as most men did, that the frontier required frontier methods, and that the accumulated wisdom of European centuries had no application in Montana territory. He was wrong, but Nora had loved him anyway. They'd come west in 1876, newly married, full of the peculiar optimism that frontier life demanded. Thomas found work in the copper mines. Nora tended their small homestead and dreamed of the children they would have. For 3 years, the dream held. Then the tunnel collapsed. They brought Thomas home on a board, his body broken, but his face strangely peaceful, as though he'd simply decided to sleep. Nora sat with him through the night, while Flint whimpered in the corner, and by morning she'd become something the valley had no framework for. A young widow with no family, no prospects, and no intention of disappearing quietly. The whispers started within a week. She should have insisted he find safer work. She should have prayed harder. She'd been seen talking to herself in the garden. Wasn't that a sign of something unnatural? A woman alone was a woman suspect, and grief made people cruel in ways they'd never admit to themselves. By the time Jonas Wheeler proposed the banishment, framed, of course, as a generous land grant to help the poor widow start fresh, Nora understood that Elkhorn Valley had no place for her anymore, so she would make her own place. The first month, she focused on the larger of the 2 side chambers. It measured roughly 20 feet by 15, with a ceiling high enough to stand comfortably and walls of pale sandstone worn smooth by whatever ancient waters had carved these passages long before Thomas Morrow arrived with his pickaxe and his dreams. The floor was uneven, littered with debris from Morrow's excavations, but solid underneath. Nora cleared it stone by stone, bucket by bucket, her shoulders screaming and her hands blistering through her gloves. Flint watched from the tunnel entrance, patient as a prayer. "They think I'm building my own grave," she told him on the evening of the 14th day, as she sat outside the cave eating cold beans and hard bread. "Maybe they're right." Flint's amber eyes reflected the firelight. He didn't argue. The first visitor came in early November, when Nora was hauling timber from a deadfall grove 2 miles south. Garrett Hutchkins rode up on a bay mare, ostensibly checking on his cattle range, but really, Nora knew, checking on the crazy widow everyone assumed would be dead by Christmas. "Mrs. Brennan," he touched his hat brim, eyes scanning the mine entrance, the stacked lumber, the precise piles of excavated stone. "Didn't expect to find you still here. Yet, here I am. What exactly are you doing with all this?" Nora wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Building. Building what?" "A home." Garrett Hutchkins was not a cruel man. He was, in fact, one of the few who had argued against her banishment. But even his sympathy had limits, and Nora saw those limits in the way his brow furrowed as understanding dawned. "In the mine? You're building a home inside the mine. The chamber stays 52 degrees year-round. Do you know what that means, Mr. Hutchkins?" He stared at her. "It means that when the temperature drops to 30 below zero, which it will, my home will still be 52 degrees. With a small fire and proper insulation, I can keep it at 65 through the worst winter Montana can offer. While your cattle freeze and your pipes burst, and your family burns through a cord of wood a week just to keep from dying, I'll be sitting in a sandstone room that the earth itself keeps warm." Garrett opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "You're building a cabin inside a cave. I'm building a cabin inside a cave. He shook his head slowly, the way men do when confronted with something beyond their experience. Mrs. Brennan, I've got to say, that's the craziest damn thing I've ever heard. Nora picked up another piece of timber. I expect you're not the last person who'll tell me that. She was right. By December, Nora had framed a proper structure within the cave chamber. A cabin within a mountain, its walls built from salvage lumber and its roof braced against the natural stone ceiling. She'd laid a flagstone floor mortared tight against drafts. She'd built a small iron stove with a chimney pipe that vented through a natural fissure in the rock, creating a draft so efficient that her fires burned clean and hot with a quarter of the wood a normal cabin required. The smaller second chamber became her root cellar and storage, and her workshop. Because Nora had noticed something during those weeks of clearing Thomas Morrow's debris. The sandstone wasn't uniform. In places, particularly along the back wall of the smaller chamber, veins of quartz ran through the pale stone like frozen lightning. And in those quartz veins, catching the light of her lantern in a way that made her heart stop, were flecks of something that definitely wasn't sandstone. Nora wasn't a miner, but she'd been married to one for 3 years, and she'd listened when Thomas talked about his work. Really listened, the way Oma had taught her to listen to everything. Color in the quartz means something, Thomas had said once. Doesn't always mean gold, but it means something. She said nothing to anyone. She simply kept working, kept excavating, kept expanding her strange underground home while the valley shook its collective head and waited for winter to finish what banishment had started. The first major storm hit on January 8th, 1880. Temperature dropped to 29 below zero. Wind screamed down from the mountains like something alive and hungry. Snow piled in drifts that buried fences, collapsed barns, froze livestock where they stood. Nora sat in her cave cabin, 61 degrees, reading by lamplight while Flint dozed on a braided rug she'd made from fabric scraps. Her horse, Banner, stood in a small stable she'd built against the cave's outer wall, sheltered from the wind by the same hillside that protected Nora herself. She'd insulated the stable with straw packed between double walls, another of Oma's tricks, and Banner steamed contentedly in his 35-degree enclosure, while other horses in the valley froze to death in their drafty barns. 3 weeks into the storm, Garrett Hutchkins showed up at her cave entrance, frost in his beard and desperation in his eyes. "Lost 12 head of cattle," he said, his voice cracking. "My wife's taken ill. House is too cold no matter how much we burn. The Wheeler place lost their roof to the wind. The whole valley's dying, Mrs. Brennan." Nora looked past him to the white hell of the blizzard. "Bring them here." "What?" "Your wife, your children, the Wheelers if they'll come, anyone who needs shelter. Bring them here." Garrett stared at the cave entrance, at the warm yellow light glowing from within, at the impossible comfort radiating from the cursed ground where they'd banished an inconvenient widow. "Mrs. Brennan, I don't—" "The earth keeps what you give it," Nora said. "Right now, I have warmth to give. Bring anyone who needs it." By the storm's end, 17 people had sheltered in Nora's cave cabin and the adjoining chambers. Jonas Wheeler himself, the man who'd proposed her banishment, huddled with his family in the storage chamber, which Nora had hastily converted with bedrolls and blankets. His wife, Margaret, wept with relief as warmth seeped back into her children's blue-tinged fingers. No one asked about the quartz samples Nora had quietly covered with a tarp. No one noticed the small leather pouch she'd tucked behind a stone in the wall. They were too busy surviving to wonder what else the crazy widow might have found in her hole in the ground. When the thaw came in late February, they emerged into a valley transformed by loss. Livestock dead by the hundreds. Barns collapsed. 2 families lost entirely, frozen in homes that couldn't withstand what Montana had thrown at them. And at the northern edge of the valley, a widow and her dog standing in the entrance to a cave that had saved 17 lives. Jonas Wheeler came to see her 3 days after the storm broke. He stood outside the cave entrance, hat in hands, looking smaller than Nora remembered. Flint watched him from beside her leg, amber eyes unblinking. "I came to apologize," Jonas said. Nora waited. What I did, banishing you here, expecting you to fail or leave, it was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I proposed it. I was angry about the mine collapse, angry about the men who died, and you were," he swallowed. "You were the easiest target, a woman alone, someone who couldn't fight back." "I could have fought back. You could have, but you didn't." He looked up at the cave, at the cabin visible through the entrance, at the stable where Banner nickered softly. "You built this instead. You built something that saved my family, after what I did to you." "Mr. Wheeler," Nora's voice was steady, "I didn't build this to save your family. I built it to save myself. That your family benefited doesn't make you any less guilty for what you did. It just makes me the kind of person my grandmother raised me to be." Jonas flinched. "Your grandmother? She taught me that vengeance is a waste of warmth, that you share what you have because sharing makes it grow." She paused. "She also taught me that an apology isn't finished until you ask how you can make it right." For a long moment, Jonas was silent. "How can I make it right, Mrs. Brennan?" Nora reached into her pocket and pulled out the leather pouch. She opened it, letting the contents spill into her palm. Gold. 3 small nuggets, gleaming like frozen sunlight. Jonas's eyes went wide. "Thomas Morrow was right," Nora said. "There's gold in Copper Ridge. I've been finding it for months in the quartz veins at the back of my claim. The claim you gave me as punishment." She closed her fist around the nuggets. "Right now, I'm the only one who knows how much is there. Could be just a few ounces. Could be a fortune. Either way, it's mine. You made certain of that when you banished me." Jonas Wheeler looked like a man watching his own hanging. "But I don't want to be the richest woman in a valley that hates me," Nora continued. "I want to be part of a community, a real one where people share what they know and help each other survive." She met his eyes. "So here's how you make it right. You help me build something bigger than a cabin in a cave. You help me teach this valley how to survive winters like the one we just had. And when the gold starts coming out of this hillside, you help me make sure it benefits everyone, not just me." Jonas stared at her. "You want to share it after everything we did?" "Mr. Wheeler, I've been alone for almost a year now. I've learned a great deal about solitude." Flint pressed closer to her leg, and she rested a hand on his shaggy head. "I've learned that being right isn't nearly as satisfying as being home, and you can't have a home without a community to build it in." She extended her hand. After a long moment, Jonas Wheeler took it. They found more gold, considerably more. By summer of 1880, Nora's claim had yielded enough gold to make her technically the wealthiest individual in Elkhorn Valley. But you wouldn't have known it from looking at her. She still lived in her cave cabin, still wore the same practical clothes, still worked alongside the crews she'd hired from among the valley's struggling families. What she spent her money on was education. She brought in engineers from Denver to study her cave construction, to understand the principles of earth-sheltered building that her grandmother had learned in the Black Forest. She commissioned a proper survey of the valley's geology, identifying other sites where similar structures might be built. She funded the construction of 3 community shelters, partially underground, earth-bermed, designed to survive any winter Montana could conjure. And she taught. Anyone who wanted to learn how to build the way she'd built was welcome at her homestead. She showed them how to site a structure to take advantage of the Earth's thermal mass. She demonstrated the straw insulation techniques that kept Banner's stable warm. She explained, in patient detail, the principles that Oma had passed down from a German tradition stretching back centuries. "It's not magic," she'd say, standing before clusters of skeptical ranchers and curious wives. "It's just physics. The Earth stays roughly the same temperature year-round, cool in summer, warm in winter. If you build with that fact instead of against it, you don't have to fight the cold. You let the Earth do the work." Some of them still thought she was crazy, but after the winter of 1880, fewer and fewer were willing to say so out loud. Garrett Hutchkins became her most vocal advocate. "I called her crazy," he'd tell anyone who'd listen, often while standing in one of the earth-sheltered structures that now dotted the valley. Right to her face, I called her the craziest damn woman I'd ever met, and she just kept building, didn't argue, didn't defend herself, just kept hauling timber and stacking stone. He'd shake his head, wonder in his voice. She was building something I couldn't see, because I wasn't looking. None of us were. We were too busy knowing how things had always been done to notice someone doing them better. Jonas Wheeler's conversion was quieter, but perhaps more profound. He worked alongside Nora's construction crews, learning the techniques he'd once mocked. When his own rebuilt home, earth-bermed, south-facing, insulated with the methods Nora taught, survived the winter of 1881 without burning more than half the wood his old home had required, he wept. "I banished you to paradise," he told Nora one evening, as they stood outside her cave watching the sunset paint Copper Ridge in shades of amber and rose. "I meant it as punishment, and I handed you everything. The gold, the cave, the chance to prove what you knew." "You handed me nothing," Nora said gently. "You handed me rock and snow and solitude. What I built from those things, I built myself, with your grandmother's knowledge, which makes it a gift, not a theft. Oma gave it freely. I'm giving it freely. That's how knowledge works, Mr. Wheeler. It gets bigger when you share it, not smaller. The only way to waste it is to hoard it." Flint, gray-muzzled now but still alert, pressed against her leg. His amber eyes caught the fading light. "You really don't hate us," Jonas said. It wasn't quite a question. "I really don't. Hate would have kept me warm through that first winter about as well as your drafty barns kept your cattle warm. I didn't have room for it." She smiled, just slightly. "Besides, if I hated you, I couldn't belong here. and I find, after everything, that belonging is what I wanted all along. The years turned, as years do. The gold continued to flow from Nora's claim, not an inexhaustible fortune, but enough to transform Elkhorn Valley from a struggling frontier settlement into a prosperous community. She reinvested most of it locally, funding a school, a community hall, a proper doctor's practice. She established a fund that helped families build earth-sheltered homes of their own, interest-free loans repaid by teaching the techniques to others. Flint died in the spring of 1887, slipping away in his sleep on the braided rug in the cave cabin where he'd spent his happiest years. Nora buried him on the hillside above the mine entrance, in a spot where the morning sun fell warm and golden. A month later, a half-starved dog with gray-brown fur and amber eyes wandered into the valley, as though drawn by some force that defied explanation. He walked straight to Nora's cave and sat down at her feet, looking up at her with an expression that said, quite clearly, "Well, are we doing this or not?" She named him Ember, and he proved just as loyal as his predecessor, though whether he was actually Flint's descendant or simply a kindred spirit, Nora never knew or much cared. Banner passed in 1889, and Nora bought a sturdy mare named Copper to replace him. The mare's foal, born in 1891, she named Promise. In 1902, 23 years after her banishment, Nora Brennan stood at the entrance to her cave cabin and watched a delegation from the territorial governor's office pick their way up the path. Ember stood beside her, gray-muzzled now, his amber eyes watchful. They wanted to document her work. Word had spread far beyond Elkhorn Valley. Her earth-sheltered building techniques were being adopted across Montana territory, into Wyoming, even down into Colorado. Engineers wrote papers about the principles she'd learned from her grandmother. The governor himself wanted to recognize her contributions to frontier survival. Nora listened politely. She showed them the cabin within the cave, still snug after 2 decades. She walked them through the community shelters, the modified homes, the school that stayed warm through every winter without bankrupting its heating budget. She introduced them to the second generation of Valley residents who'd grown up knowing these techniques as simply the way things were done. When they asked her to write a book, to capture her knowledge for posterity, she thought about it for 3 days before agreeing. "But I'll need help," she told them. "I'm not a writer. I'll need someone who can take what I know and make it useful for people who will never meet me." They sent her a young woman from the state university, bright, curious, full of questions. Her name was Elizabeth, and she reminded Nora, painfully and wonderfully, of herself at that age. For 6 months, Elizabeth lived in Elkhorn Valley, interviewing Nora and the other residents, documenting every technique, every principle, every hard-won lesson. The book they produced, Building with the Earth, Practical Principles of Thermal Construction, was published in 1904 and remained in print for 40 years. Nora's name was on the cover, but inside, in the dedication, she wrote, "For my grandmother, who taught me that knowledge is a fire. It only dies if you refuse to pass it on. And for Elkhorn Valley, who learned that the stranger they banished might be the neighbor they needed. May we all be slower to judge and quicker to learn." She never married again, not because she opposed the idea, but because the right person never appeared. And Nora had learned long ago that some things couldn't be forced. You built what you could with what you had, and you let the rest go. What she had, by the end, was more than enough. The valley prospered. The techniques spread. Children who'd sheltered in her cave during the terrible winter of 1880 grew up to build homes of their own using the methods she taught their parents. Some left for other territories, carrying the knowledge with them. Some stayed and raised families in earth-sheltered homes that their grandchildren would still be living in a century later. Nora watched it all with quiet satisfaction. She'd wanted to survive. She'd ended up transforming a community. She'd wanted to belong. She'd ended up teaching a territory. She'd wanted to honor her grandmother's memory. She'd ended up creating a legacy that would outlive everyone who'd ever mocked her. The gold ran out eventually. By 1895, the mine had yielded all it was going to yield, a considerable sum, but not inexhaustible. Nora didn't much care. The money had never been the point. "They gave me cursed ground," she told Elizabeth once during those months of interviews. "They expected me to fail or leave. And maybe I should have. Maybe a sensible person would have taken the hint and gone somewhere easier." She looked around the cave cabin, at the warm stone walls, the efficient little stove, the window she'd installed facing east to catch the morning light. But I wasn't sensible. I was stubborn, and I had flint, and I had Oma's voice in my head, and I had 60 acres of rock that nobody wanted. She smiled. "It turns out that's exactly what I needed." Nora Brennan died in the spring of 1912, at the age of 59. She died in her cave cabin, in the bed she'd slept in for 33 years, with Ember's grandson, a dog named Ash, with the same gray-brown fur and amber eyes as all his forebears, lying at her feet. The cause was pneumonia. Ironic, perhaps, for a woman who'd spent her life mastering warmth. But the body has its own limitations that even the best-built shelter cannot overcome. The funeral drew people from 3 counties, former skeptics, now white-haired and humbled, students who'd learned at her feet and gone on to build wonders of their own, the children and grandchildren of those she'd sheltered in 1880, carrying flowers to honor the woman who'd saved their families before most of them were born. Jonas Wheeler, 81 years old and bent with age, stood at the front of the crowd. When it was his turn to speak, he said simply, "I wronged her, and she saved me. I don't have words big enough for what that means." They buried her on the hillside above the cave, next to Flint. The stone they raised was simple: Nora Brennan, 1853 to 1912. She built warmth from stone and shared it with everyone today. Elkhorn Valley is a small town in Montana that most people have never heard of. The cave where Nora built her cabin is on the historical register, preserved exactly as she left it. School groups visit every spring to learn about frontier ingenuity and the woman who turned banishment into belonging. The earth-sheltered building techniques she championed are still studied by architects and engineers. Her book remains a reference for sustainable construction. The principles her grandmother taught her in a Pennsylvania kitchen, the same principles that kept her alive through that first terrible winter, have influenced how thousands of buildings have been designed and built. But if you ask the old-timers in Elkhorn Valley what Nora Brennan's real legacy was, they won't talk about construction techniques or gold strikes or books. They'll tell you about community, about how a woman who had every reason to hate them chose to help them instead. about how knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied, and how even the deepest wrongs can be opportunities for grace if you're stubborn enough to make them so. She could have been rich and bitter, they'll say. She could have bought the whole valley and made us all tenants. God knows she had the right. Instead, she taught us to survive. She taught us that the old ways and the new ways could work together. She taught us that the crazy woman in the cave might be the smartest person in the territory if we just stop laughing long enough to listen. They'll shake their heads, those old-timers, wonder still fresh in their voices after all these years. She built a cabin inside a mountain. She found gold in cursed ground. She saved us from ourselves. A pause, always. And she shared it all, every last bit. The cave still holds warmth in winter, cool in summer. Flint and Nora rest together on the hillside above, keeping watch over a valley that finally learned what they'd known all along. The earth keeps what you give it. Knowledge gets bigger when you share it. And sometimes the exile becomes the cornerstone.